Our old friend Steve Sebelius is joining us from the Las Vegas Review-Journal. Good to see you again, Steve. Long time no chat. Uh,
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
it's only been a moment since the 2020 general election, but there's already some jockeying for position going on right now in Nevada for some high-profile races down the line. Let's talk about a couple of key ones and just kind of get a flavor of what's happening on the political ground. First of all, with governor. What is the moving and shaking going on, particularly on the Republican side, of who might run against Governor Sisolak?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, John. I mean, each year, earlier and earlier, the cycle starts sooner. Normally we wouldn't see any kind of talk about the governor's race, the 2022 races, until after the legislature is over. Now we're doing it during the legislature. I think eventually we're going to get to the point where it's going to start happening immediately after the previous election, or maybe even before. So you asked about governor. On the Democratic side, obviously, Steve Sisolak is the incumbent, and he is planning to run for re-election, or at least all indications are at this point that he's going to plan to run for re-election. There have been some whispers that he's not going to do it, but I happen to think that if that was the case, he probably would have said so. Maybe if shortly after the legislative session concludes, he'll say so if he's not planning to do it. But right now, all indications are that he is going to run. So there you have the Democratic side. Now on the Republican side, there's something interesting going on that you don't always see. You have a trio of candidates that really bubbled to the surface, and those candidates are Representative Mark Amodei of the 2nd District, lives up in Reno, the former Lieutenant Governor Mark Hutchison, who is also a former state senator, and Clark County Sheriff Joe Lombardo. They both live down here in southern Nevada. And what's interesting and somewhat unprecedented is that those three are talking. They're having conversations behind the scenes with each other, basically on the premise of, look, a Republican primary where we all run against each other, spend all the money, and come out wounded and poor is not in the best interest of the party. So we need to agree amongst ourselves who is the best candidate, and then that person will run without having to deal with a Republican primary with high name contenders. There's going to be probably some people who get in who you've never heard of, but just the top people. And so those three are the names that we hear most often.
But it would also seem there are some other names that are out there on the Republican side. Former Senator Dean Heller might want to run for something again. There is Adam Laxalt still looking for possibly running for office one more time. Are there some other names besides those three that you're hearing might jump in? Understanding that it's still a long way away.
It is still a long way away, and there are some other names. Interestingly enough, Dean Heller has been mentioned. He wanted to run for governor before, but he deferred to Adam Laxalt. I think he may regret that decision now, given that Laxalt performed so poorly in the general. But we still assume, regardless of that performance, that Adam Laxalt will perform well in a Republican primary. So he is going to be a formidable candidate, regardless of which race he chooses. Right now, it looks like he's going to run for Senate if he wants to do that. But we've also heard names of folks such as State Senator Ben Kiekefer of Reno, Heidi Gansert, also of Reno and also a state senator, potential candidates to get into that race as well. They have some disadvantages. Their name recognition is not very high in southern Nevada, which is obviously where most of the voters live. And they're both moderates. And that brings up a really good point, John, and that is this. Can a moderate Republican, someone such as a Mark Hutchison or a Ben Kiekefer, win a Republican primary? What does the Trump base do? In Adam Laxalt's case, we know what they'll do. They'll turn out and vote for Laxalt, no question. But a moderate, is that person going to get support in a Republican primary? That's an open question, and that could really affect some of the candidates here.
And I would imagine also, aside from where that former President Trump base would go, there's also just the pure issue of money. Where is the money in the Nevada Republican Party? Of where would the supporters go? Would it go towards a more moderate angle, as you were talking about those three sort of names being whispered the most right now, or more towards, say, Adam Laxalt?
That and that really comes down to the pragmatism of politics. If you are giving money and promoting a candidate based on your heart, you may prefer a more conservative candidate. But if you're a pragmatist, you look at Steve Sisolak, who, despite all the criticism against him, is a very moderate to conservative Democrat. You look at him and you say, in order to defeat him, we have to have a moderate to conservative Republican. So we need somebody in that range. And that person who is going to be a great general election candidate may not be a great primary candidate. So you have to convince the base during that primary that, look, the best chance that we have of winning this seat, having a Republican governor again and defeating Steve Sisolak, is to have a moderate Republican. But I don't know that that logic is going to be accepted by a lot of the base. I think the base wants someone who is perceived as a fighter like Donald Trump, somebody who's not afraid to mix it up, to dish out insults on Twitter and on the campaign trail. And that's not Mark Hutchison. He is not that guy. So while it's the oldest dilemma, while he would be a great general election candidate, is he going to be a good primary candidate? And that factor really is probably part of the discussions that's going on right now amongst the three top candidates.
Before we move on from the governor's race, on the Democratic side, obviously, as you mentioned, there's Steve Sisolak. He's the incumbent. He is a Democrat. You mentioned he's in all likelihood going to run again. But is it possible, given the recent changes with the Nevada Democratic Party, that he could be primaried?
It is possible. I have heard more than once from more than one person the name Marilyn Kirkpatrick as a potential candidate for governor. She's done a really good job as chairwoman of the Clark County Commission, and I think she might have aspirations to do that. I think that might be less likely. You mentioned the Democratic Party and whether or not a progressive candidate, a more liberal candidate in the mold of Bernie Sanders, would challenge Steve Sisolak for governor. I tend to think that is probably not likely, and the reason I say that is that the people who took over the state party, while they are definitely progressive and more liberal than Steve Sisolak, there's no question about that. I think they realize that they have stewardship of this party now. And if they were to go and primary an incumbent governor, the first Democratic governor to reign in Nevada in 20 years, I think they would lose credibility, lose the ability to raise money, and run into other problems down the road. So I think it's less likely you'd have a progressive challenger to Steve Sisolak than you'd have maybe somebody like a Marilyn Kirkpatrick, who is more in the mode of the incumbent, but just has a different style.
And of course has her own history in Carson City as well from her past time in the legislature. Let's look ahead to another big race on the horizon for 2022, Senator Catherine Cortez Masto's seat. I guess it's kind of the same discussion. What names, mainly of Republicans, are lining up to try and raise money and maybe take her on? Is it a lot of the same roster of folks you were just talking about for governor?
Yeah, the roster's a lot shorter in the Senate race because right now it's a repeat of 2018 in the governor's race. And that is Adam Laxalt is said to be interested in challenging Catherine Cortez Masto for Senate. And as a result of that, a lot of other Republicans are sort of shying away from that race. Now, I would think based on the general election performance that Adam Laxalt had in 2018, that these other Republicans wouldn't be scared to take him on, to basically say, look, he ran a statewide race against Steve Sisolak. He lost. He's not the guy to represent us against Catherine Cortez Masto, who's probably the most formidable Democratic candidate going through. But that's not the case. Adam Laxalt, if he gets into a primary, will likely win a primary. And so Republicans are kind of taking a step back and saying, well, we're going to wait to see what he decides before we decide to do it. Now, if he doesn't do it, the floodgates will open and you'll have the Ben Kekevers, the Heidi Ganserts, maybe somebody who elected not to run for governor decides to run for state senate instead. But really, everyone's waiting on Laxalt to make the call at this point.
And obviously, because of the way the U.S. Senate is right now and how divided it is, not just Senator Cortez Masto, obviously all of the seats could conceivably sway which way the Senate goes. But is she a vulnerable senator right now? Would you say at this point in her term in the Senate, is she someone politically weak enough in terms of popular opinion that she could be beaten?
Could she be? It's always theoretically possible that she could be beaten, but I think it's going to be tough. And it's going to be tough for a couple of reasons. One, she is now in leadership. She took on a very unenviable task and headed up the Democrats' campaign committee last time. And against all odds, barely by the hair of her chinny chin chin, got the Senate to be evenly divided, 50-50. And now with Vice President Harris, a slight advantage for the Democrats. And so that was something that people didn't expect was going to happen. And she presided over that. She has a leadership post now, which means the Democrats are going to defend her, and they're going to defend her seat with whatever resources she's going to need to keep that seat. And so I think you're going to see a huge amount of money, no matter who runs, there's going to be a huge amount of money spent in this race on both sides. And so I would say of the two, if I was running, I would rather be Cortez Masto than Sisolak. I think Sisolak is probably more vulnerable because of the criticism that's been heaped upon him by his handling of the coronavirus. Although a poll that the Review Journal conducted not too long ago found his favorability above his unfavorables, so it may not be as bad as we see on social media. Probably nothing really as bad as we see on social media. But I think she's going to be very tough to beat because she's an extremely disciplined candidate. She does not make mistakes. She doesn't blurt out things before she thinks about them. And she's got a good record to go on. I mean, passing of the coronavirus relief, several different iterations of that. If this infrastructure bill passes, the benefits to Nevada from that, a lot of things that she can tout as reasons to return her to office.
One other major story of the week is the change from John Lee, North Las Vegas mayor, a lifelong Democrat, now goes on Fox News and says he is a Republican. What is your reading of the motivation? We spoke with him, as I'm sure you have as well. What is your reading of the motivation, and what are we not hearing about what the long-term impact of that decision is for his future and just kind of what's next?
Yeah, I think I think this is probably less surprising than the attention that's been given to it, and we have all given attention to it because he's a high-profile person. He's the mayor of the third largest city in Nevada. But in another sense, John Lee has never really been comfortable as a Democrat. He has been courted to change parties since his time in the legislature. He was served in the Assembly and the Senate, and he was approached numerous times to change parties because he was such a conservative Democrat. I take him at his word that he thought that the recent changeover in the Nevada State Democratic Party, where people who were affiliated with the Democratic Socialists of America took over, he said that was too much for him. His values didn't align with that, and so he was going to switch to the Republican Party. But I think really what's going on, the heart of your question is, the why. Why now, after all this time, would he do it? And obviously the answer for that is the answer to some of these other questions, which is a possible run for governor. He steadfastly refused when I talked to him to talk about that. He said he's happy being mayor. I just want to focus on being mayor. But he did say something interesting, and that is, he affirmed what he said in 2017 when he got elected to his second term, that he was not going to run for a third term. So that means he's open and available and has time on his hands in 2022 when the next governor's race is open. So I think he is looking at that as a potential race going forward. And so I think that's really the motivation at this point. He is a conservative Democrat. He knows that running as a Democrat against Steve Sisolak in a primary was probably not the way to go. But in the Republican side, a guy who was formerly a Democrat, businessman, helped turn North Las Vegas around. That's a good story to sell on the Republican side as well. So I would suspect that we may see that happen in 2022. It's just that he's not willing to talk about it right at this point.
He wants to talk about the Apex waterline a little bit more.
Yes. Well, it's got a good story to tell on an Apex. That could be he called it the breadbasket of Southern Nevada, and I don't disagree with that. I think that has a lot of potential.
It's a big project, to be sure. Steve, always good to see you, sir, and look forward to reading you in the RJ.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.